Hello, good evening, and welcome to this evening's English Catholic History Association talk. And this evening's talk is by Peter J. Harrison on Clifton Cathedral, its buildings, and its people. So we're going to hear a lot about that this evening. So you're very welcome wherever you are. For those who wish to, there's a chat box. It might be at the bottom of your screen or at the top, whichever of those two. And then if you'd like to put questions into the chat box, if you have any questions, that is, and then we can ask Peter at the end of the talk. So I'm going to introduce Peter anyway. Peter's had a long association with the cathedral in Clifton, going back, I think, to the 1960s. So he's a mine of information about the church, its purpose, its building, and all sorts of things, and of course the parish community that it serves as well in Bristol. So very welcome everybody, and welcome Peter.
Well, I'm not used to Zoom and talking online, so I hope that goes well for you. The first slide there shows the cathedral seal. And just to emphasize that I'm trying to set my talk as not just about the building, but about the people. So just to point out some of the, sorry, I got open at the wrong page there. It wouldn't do, would it? Just let me go back. I'm sorry. Yes, somehow. But I was looking at something earlier on and I found the wrong page. So thank you for inviting me to address the English Catholic History Association. My subject covers a period from 1830 to 1973. And much of what I will speak about took place more than 50 years ago. But being good historians, as I'm sure many of you may be, some of you even academics, you might be asking, what has the building of a cathedral to do with English Catholic history? Indeed, is it history yet? Or is it just history in the making? Well, you can judge for yourselves. The previous presentation in this series was given by Dr. Joseph Shaw, The Latin Mass and the Intellectuals, which offers a very interesting contrast to what I have to say. I was ordained priest in 1964 in the Pontifical College in Lisbon. And therefore, I was reared, both as a child and as a young adult, in the pre-Vatican II era. So familiar with the Mass as celebrated in the Roman Missal of Pope Pius V, with some adaptations that have been made over the years since 1570. And I want to stress that the Catholic community in Clifton in Bristol had also followed that same spiritual and liturgical path. I am a personal witness and a collaborator in the design and building of the cathedral in Bristol between 1964 and 1973. In a way, I'm privileged to have played my part in the events, and so to put them on record for my future, my book, Clifton Cathedral, The Building and People, published in 2023 at the time of the Golden Jubilee of this opening of the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul at Clifton. That is my personal contribution to the record of this history. So to look at the history of the growing Catholic community in Clifton between 1830 and 1973 is very much part of the story. the Catholic community in Bristol during that period was largely fed by immigration from Europe and Ireland. And in a concerted drive to build churches and schools in what was then the Western Vicariate, until the restoration of the Catholic hierarchy in 1850, when the traditional counties of Wiltshire, Gloucestershire, and Somerset, including Bristol, became the Diocese of Clifton. Please note that the images that I shall show are copyright and may not be used without appropriate consents. I am happy to take questions then at the end, rather than to interrupt the flow. So I know it's a poor image, but this is a drawing by Henry Goodrich, dated 1830. It shows a Palladian-style church. It was to be built in Bristol in the 1830s, but a city then with a staunch evangelical and free church ethos, the Catholic community in Clifton, secretly through a third party, purchased a piece of land in Clifton called Stony Fields. It was actually a stone record of, digging and quarrying. The Catholic community, as you can see, had an ambitious plan to build a grey, grandiose, Palladian-style church with massive stone columns. And the plan building, in a way, reveals the confidence of a community trying to assert itself following Catholic emancipation. But the foundations repeatedly collapsed, the money quickly exhausted, and so the unroofed ruin and the site had to be abandoned to the Newport Bank, as the loan could not be repaid. In 1847, Bishop Ullathorne, of then the Western Vicariate, decided to repurchase the ruin, and he commissioned the architect Charles Hanson, who, by the way, did Clifton College as well in his time. And Charles Hanson was asked to design a light construction with timber pillars, simply to roof the ruins rather like a ship's framework upside down. Just put your architect's reputation in your pocket, Ullathorne told Hanson. When completed, the ruin had been roofed. It still had no windows, but at least the Catholics of Clifton now had somewhere to worship out of the rain. Charles Hanson didn't give up. Later, with his architect's reputation back in his pocket once more, he designed an elaborate style Romanesque building. It would have been very impressive, but it was never fully completed. And the history of what happened next then is related in my book. And by the time you get between 1850 and 1910, some improvements have been made, including the installation of windows. The furnishings had been put in. And after the two world wars and the financial depression of the 1930s, what had always been a temporary pro-cathedral building was by now in a very poor state. And despite the appearance in the next picture, a great deal needed to be done. So I took this picture in 1973, so that you have a view of what it was more like at the time that the new cathedral was opened. So back to 1964-5, with a view to renovating the old structure, the Bishop, Joseph Rotherham, instructed a firm of civil engineers to investigate the site. And their report stated, the site was fundamentally unstable and could not be relied upon for any future construction. Remember that between 1962 and 1965, the bishops of the Second Council of the Vatican had been meeting in Rome. And when we look at the Cathedral of Clifton today, maybe we do need to feel that breath of fresh air and the sense of enthusiasm for change and renewal in the life of the Church, as called for by the Council's decree on Sacrosanctum Concilium on the renewal of the liturgy, for instance. Remarkably, when you think that over 2,000 very traditional bishops voted for that change, for the renewal of the liturgy, with just 4 bishops from the world voting non-placet. The Ecumenical Council, with its drive for renewal and modernizing reform of the Church, had, of course, a very significant impact on the design and planning of the first cathedral in the world built to implement the recommended changes in the Catholic worship. So, looking at the new cathedral, the first question is, where do you start? Should I ask you to get a piece of paper and pencil and draw your own design for a cathedral? Well, it makes a starting point because in 1965, the architectural firm Percy Thomas Partnership had been asked to take on the cathedral project. They found themselves with that question: how to design a cathedral? What is a cathedral? Where does one start? Well, just to remind you, we're all familiar, no doubt, with the layout and design of a typical church in its medieval form, and in some cases still to today. But first I would like you to think about architecture. Recently I came across what I call a tweet, it's X of course, stating architecture is art. But I have to ask, is that right? How do you approach the design of a new building? Well, I thought in the 1960s there are 3 new cathedrals that we might use as examples. There's the Church of England's new Coventry Cathedral, a modern but traditional design of a medieval building in the Anglican tradition. Simply a traditional design using modern materials with some very fine modern artwork. I understand the estimated cost was £1.5 million. And then a little later in 1960s, there's the Roman Catholic Metropolitan Cathedral of Christ the King in Liverpool, or Paddy's Wigwam, as some people call it. It's an example of architecture is art, as the project was launched as an architectural design competition, accompanied by just 20 pages of documentation. Then the competitors had 3 weeks to decide their designs and submit their competition entries. As we know, the competition was won by Sir Frederick Gibbard. The building was built and opened in 1967 at a reported cost of £1 million. Conceived as a work of art, the building in several ways didn't really serve some of the needs of the changing Catholic liturgy then or now, and possibly due to the construction and design process, subsequent engineering issues involved vast additional expenditure, I understand. So at Clifton, the Percy Thomas partnership led by project architect Ronald Weeks, who actually I only found out a couple of years ago came second in the Liverpool competition and was the only competitor commended for his entry. He decided to follow a different architectural principle, that in design, form follows function. This approach requires lengthy and detailed consultation to establish the client's overall objectives and to establish the purpose of the building. And of course, in this instance, the requirements of the liturgical renewal emerging from the Second Council of the Vatican. So, what were the client's expectations? Well, the Bishop of Clifton, Joseph Rotherham, had some very ambitious requests, it has to be said. Firstly, the design must meet the modern liturgical requirements of the Church emerging from the Council. And another word about that maybe in a moment. Secondly, the bishop suggested the building should last for at least 300 years. Frankly, he was very anxious not to repeat the experience of the 1830s and the problems with the site of the pro-cathedral church in Clifton, with its collapsing foundations and severe financial worries. And the bishop insisted finally that the end cost of the design and construction must sit within the available financial envelope so that there would be no long-term debt on the diocese or the people. To this day, the liturgical changes continue to cause debate, don't they? So, a quick word about the Second Vatican Council and the background to reform. It seems the Council had a threefold conceptual framework, probably set by Pope John the 23rd, or his advisors anyway. The first of these is ressourcement, understood to meaning the search of the historical sources and the records of the past, to reapply the theological wisdom of the past to the present time, and a concept you may value as the work of a true historian, to recognize that new research and new researchers, often with fresh perspectives, lead to fresh evidence and new appreciations of the existing traditions and history. The second principle, I suppose, was aggiornamento, maybe an updating or letting in of the fresh air, as Pope John the 23rd referred to it. Simply renewal to meet the needs of modern times, and where necessary, by removing any accretions of centuries. And actually there were many. And finally, the development of doctrine. I would expect you to understand the significance of this term used by Cardinal Newman as being not about changing true doctrine, but rather about the deepening of the understanding of the truths of faith or of science and its practice in modern times. Well, we all encounter change through our lifetime. It is a challenge. And writing in his book, True and False Reform in the Church, in 1950, the Dominican theologian Yves Congar wrote, "The church is like any living thing. It's marked both by continuity and by progress, with progress within continuity. So the central core of the gospel's truth and tradition hasn't changed, but just as life changes for us, the church changes too, as it encounters the modern world. It must grow, change, and adapt, but it remains the same essential, living people of God, established by Christ and inspired by the Holy Spirit. Pope Francis' synodality process, I think, is part of that growth and renewal to meet the needs of today's world. And his successor, Pope Leo XIV, has so far followed the successor of the Apostle Peter, and we will see how his era unfolds. So, resourcement, using historical resources, aggiornamento, updating, development of doctrine, deepening of the understanding of the unchanging truth. So back to Clifton, 1965. At Clifton, the consultations and the discussions started. The briefing sections with the architectural team were often, we met weekly with project architect Ronald Weeks, and he would ask probing questions in his following of the form follows function principle. There were so many questions, I might add, which are on for months and months and months. What is an altar? Is it a pagan stone of sacrifice or a supper table? What is a bishop? What does he do in the liturgy? Why is there a lady chapel? Now, frankly, some members of the committee found it quite challenging to answer these questions, whereas priests, such familiar things had always been taken for granted. And as I had studied liturgy for 4 years at the English College in Lisbon, actually I was better placed sometimes to respond to questions, though I did try not, as a junior priest, to say too much. At an early stage, it was agreed that it was very important to keep the faithful and parishioners informed, both about the changes in the liturgy as they came along and about the cathedral project itself. So I initiated a series of monthly liturgy group meetings in the parish where changes in the liturgy were openly discussed and questions answered. Usually there were 40 or 50 parishioners would attend and taking part in questions and answers. And these meetings continued after the cathedral was open and in use. So in the liturgical briefing committees then set up by the bishop to advise the Percy Thomas Partnership, Ronald Weeks' constant questions to all of us, what is this, why is it used, and how, this informed the shape and design at every stage as the design emerged. In the liturgical sphere, one of the key elements in the decree of the liturgy is the phrase, in the restoration and promotion of the sacred liturgy, the full and active participation of the faithful is to be considered before all else. That phrase, full and active, is actually not a very good translation of the Latin, which calls for a full and authentic participation. But that necessarily was one of the key drivers in the mind of the design team. The faith community of the Pro-Cathedral Church of the 12 Apostles over many years had a longing to restore or improve their church. And the community, with its weekly second collection at Mass, their Christmas fairs, raffles and football pools, had collected the remarkable sum at that time of £250,000 for the Pro-Cathedral Renovation Fund. But that amount, large as it was quite insufficient. And then, quite unexpectedly, a group of businessmen came forward and offered, on condition of anonymity, to make a donation. On condition, too, that a new site be chosen. And this finance, combined with the available monies, together with the eventual sale of the site in Park Place, made it possible to build on a new site. So we began by 1967 to see some of the thoughts that Ronald Weeks was coming up. And this scheme shows the basic design elements. It shows the relationship between the different parts of the building, following that principle of form follows function. And this scheme, in turn, led to some of the designs that followed. And the image showing the relationship between different parts of the building was considered essential to the success of the eventual design. So the first three, there was a spiral design, actually a beautiful rising design from the proposed site in Pembroke Road, supported by cables, but rejected by the engineers as unlikely to last for 300 years. So Ron came up with an adaptation of that, the fan-shaped design. But the site was not deemed large enough to accommodate it. So that led to the final one, the hexagonal design. A further modification, and the one adopted in practice, incorporating the durability of the concrete structure with the environmental envelope we now have today. So the key factor in the design was the relationship between the various spaces within the building and how they would be used. As Ron Weeks once said to me, the building was constructed inside out. So this is a floor design of the cathedral. In 1969, the design received planning approval, and with the site in Clifton purchased, the building tenders went out and were published from a short list. John Lang Limited's tender of £601,208 was accepted. This is a drawing that Ron Weeks gave me, actually, which he did in 1969. Just briefly to point out some of the main entrances to the building to remain faithful to is the baptistry. The baptistry is the location where you first enter the Catholic community yourself. So the font is at the back by the entrance, but at the same time, it's at the front of the church by the nave. We go back and see that. And it's important because for the communion celebration of baptism, or for the liturgy of the Great Vigil of Easter, it's necessary for the people to see the baptistry. There is then an ambo and the lectionary for the proclamation of the Word of God. It being a cathedral, there's a cathedra for the bishop's chair, and then the altar, which is both table and stone altar for the celebration of the Supper of the Lord. and a memorial of his death and resurrection, representing the abiding presence of Christ among the people, which incidentally is why we bow to the altar when we approach it. And then the Blessed Sacrament Chapel, set aside for the resurrection of the sacrament for the sick and for prayer. In addition, there is a Lady Chapel and a Way of the Cross, with the panels displayed in the ambulatory wall, beginning with Jesus at the Last Supper and concluding with the risen Jesus again breaking bread with the disciples after the resurrection. The construction on the site began in March 1970, with the foundation stone being laid on the 26th of September that year. So stepping back in a moment to remind you of Dr. Joseph Rotherham's tough objectives. It must meet the requirements of the liturgy mandated by the Second Council, the lifetime of the building, 300 years, and the total cost envelope. So, implementing these in the design, Ronald Weeks had placed emphasis on the full and authentic participation of the people in the liturgy, with the building's design fitting the form follows function. It's just 15 meters or 45 feet from the altar to the back row, with seating for 1,000 people. So there's a certain intimacy and contact available. So to turn our attention to the builders, the fuller story is within the covers of my book, which I hope you might even read for yourself, as it reveals much about Ronald Weeks and many of the other people involved at the time, with some quite interesting facts and insights to them as people, as architects and builders. The sheer professionalism was very impressive. Everyone who worked on the site or back in the office, they were very special people, absolutely committed. They were construction people, engineers and artists too when they arrived on site. Remember, there were no computers then, just slide rules, logarithm tables, pencil and paper, and human brain. So, just over 50 years ago, on the 29th of June 1973, the Cathedral Church of Saints Peter and Paul at Clifton was opened and consecrated. And when you realise that this young cathedral church is already a Grade 2 building and has been awarded a number of prizes, for instance, by the Royal Institute of British Architects and the Concrete Society, you might remember the individuals who are responsible for this significant modern 20th century building. So, does the cathedral measure up to your idea of what a cathedral should be? Well, each of us, of course, will have our own views. I think in the end, Bishop Rotherham was satisfied. The total cost in 1973 for the construction, the fees and the site was £800,000, covered by the available funds, together with the latest sale of the former site in Park Place after the new primary school was built in Aberdeen Road. The thick concrete wall structure is secure, sitting on the new firm ground on the site. In 1973, speaking to a journalist about the new cathedral, Bishop Rotherham said, "I thought it was awful at first, but I concluded it's a very good building." So the day came for closure, and the Church of the Holy Apostles closed its doors. But before I finish, there's a short extract from the book seems to sum up what the cathedral is about and the skill and decisions made by the people who designed and built it. Monsignor Thomas Hughes, as the picture there shows, was the parish priest. And speaking in 1993 on the 20th anniversary of the building, in his homily he said, "I've always maintained that this church, this cathedral, is not just a building. It's a book, a tome of theology, of doctrine and liturgy. In design and conception, it is a visual aid to worship and an expression of how to create a living, worshipping family and community. This cathedral," he said, "is a credit to the client and all responsible for its design and construction. It's an exemplar of what can be done when will and skill come together. It's a monument to those who took the brave decisions and who saw them through. But most of all, it is for me and many others a real cathedral of the 20th century, an offering to the greater glory of God." It would be fair to say that the local Catholic community at the time was delighted with the new cathedral. The parish priests and the clergy made careful plans to ensure that the change should be gradual and carefully explained. There were, it is true, a few objectors at first, but many of them came to change their minds as they adjusted to the new building and to the new liturgy as it came along. So when the new order of the Roman Rite Mass was introduced in 1970, we had Sunday Masses, and they were celebrated in Latin or English in alternate weeks, which allowed both for the liturgical music tradition to continue while permitting the development of new religious music and to accommodate the change for the people. And this custom continued for some years after the cathedral was opened. So I have a question for you. Do you like it or do you loathe it? Well, people's views of what is beautiful or practical vary, of course, and some accustomed to the former post-Trent Mass have found change a challenge, while others find a well-celebrated vernacular New Order Mass a blessing that meets their needs. So here is a picture recently, just after the pandemic, I have to say, when numbers were beginning to return, the Sunday Mass in the Clifton Cathedral in 2024. There will be some who wish it was different, or that modifications should be made, possibly to accommodate their own ideas about art, or what a church should look like. So maybe this is the moment for you to take out that blank piece of cartridge paper out and with your pencils get you to design your own cathedral church for the era that we now live in. So will your design be a work of art, or will it follow form, follow function? And what will the historians of tomorrow conclude? A little word about acknowledgement to some of the key people involved. The builders, John Lang Co. Limited, the project architect, Ron Weeks, and his team, Monsignor Thomas Hughes, the Vicar General, who oversaw the day-to-day progress, and Dr. Bishop Joseph Rotherham, who was the bishop who took the final tough decision. This picture shows what I hope sums up the talk. It's the new cathedral sitting amidst its area of, Georgian and buildings and so on, with the former pro-cathedral exterior, for this is where the community began and then grew into the building in that we now know as the new cathedral. I have written a book, and if there are any profits, they go to what is known as the CFAS Fund. I don't make any money out of that, and that's for future generations. So the CFAS Fund welcomes donations, and if you want a copy, you can get a copy from the Clifton Cathedral administrator. If any time you want a guided tour of the cathedral, if I'm still around and kicking at the age of 85, I'm happy to do that for you too. Again, contact the cathedral for that. And with that, I thank you for listening. I hope I didn't go on too long and it all makes some kind of sense.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was a very interesting and illuminating talk this evening. If anybody would like to put their questions into the chat box, please do so now. And we could put your questions to Peter. So please put them in the box if you possibly can. I think the story of the cathedral, Peter, is very much this sort of story of 20th century Catholicism, the way it's kind of moved from one thing to another, and architecturally, in terms of this cathedral at least, has changed considerably. And I'm sure that some people would probably have strong views on this cathedral if they were asked about it. Anyway, we've got a question here. Has Clifton Cathedral inspired any subsequent church buildings to your knowledge?
Yes, it has. Ronald Weeks used the basic hexagonal design. So there is just can't remember where it is now, but it's in America. The story goes that he went to see his brother-in-law in Los Angeles, I think, and that weekend the brother-in-law said, they want to build a new church, don't you, in somewhere or other? So Ron got his wife to bring his plans over from England that weekend to fly out quickly. And she and he then designed a new church based on exactly the same basic principles of the cathedral in Clifton. It's made of wood, and one of the big debates we had when we were designing, well, they were designing the building in Clifton was, should they dish the floor? And the answer in our case was no, we didn't want to create a theatrical sort of situation. But I understand the church in America does have a slightly dished floor, which is probably an advantage. And also he added the things that we omitted. We were only a liturgical briefing committee, and sadly, the the spaces that were going to be devoted to social and youth clubs and things like that underneath the cathedral, um, the local authority insisted we have 200 parking places instead. So we never got proper facilities for the social side of the parish, which is very regrettable, really. But anyway, in America, that is being provided. He also, Ronald Weeks, was born in Buckfastleigh, and their Anglican church was burnt down, and he himself was an Anglican, by the way, and so he was asked to design a new church there, which he did, which is similar in some ways, in a small way, to the cathedral at Clifton. Unfortunately, the construction of it was not overseen, of course, by Ronald Weeks, and it was proved to be very faulty. And there are some major construction problems wrong with it. It's not with the design, not with the engineering, I think, but with the way it was constructed by the builder, who then went out of business as well, I understand. So I'm not sure what has happened about that. So yes, there are at least three that I know of. And when you look at some of the local churches here, there's St. Bernadette's in on the outskirts of Bristol, and that certainly shows some of the features of that are in the cathedral too.
Okay, another question here. It says from John and Lindsay, absolutely fascinating talk. Can you say anything about the stained glass design or makers?
Yes, I can. I regret not putting a picture on it actually up in the slide, but I didn't want to have too many slides. The artist is one um, Henry. Oh dear, I forgot the name. I know him so well. Um, if I tell you that he came to install the glass, and one day I went with Ron Weeks down to his studio in Dorset, and there was a tiny little room full of huge piles of broken glass. And he was fashioning, it's not stained glass, it's of course colored glass from over 8,000 places around Europe and of different colors, of course. Anyway, he came to the cathedral to install his windows just 3 weeks before the opening consecration. And they're set in epoxy resin and in metal frames to insert into the concrete structure. And he was on the floor with his son, and I approached him and said, um, "Henry, I'm very sorry about this, but I've got to write the cathedral guidebook, and I'm up against the deadline for publication because they want it for the day of the opening of the cathedral in 3 weeks' time, and I haven't got any pictures." And he said, got up off his foot, off his knees, with a hammer in his hand, and pretended to hit me. So never ask a, a an artist to put into words what he's done in glass. But I did realize that day that Henry had never seen his window. It was only in his mind as an artist's design. He'd never actually seen it. So there are two windows. The first one he was commissioned to write about, to design about the beauty of creation. Partly out of the council, the liturgical briefing committee and the bishop wanted to express the beauty of creation and how we should care for the environment and look after it. This is back in the 1960s, mind you, so it's nothing new. So I asked Henry how to describe it. And we came up with some words for the guidebook, that it was that wonderful experience you might experience if you were walking in the hills or beside the sea and the mountains, and you'd say, wow, what a wonderful world. So Jubilation is the name of that window. And when I take people around, young children or older people, The Friends of Bristol Cathedral got it the other day. Um, I say to them that little word, those quotation, and then I say, we've made a bit of a mess of it, haven't we? What with our carbon and our pollution and our plastics. So what are we going to do about it? And then I lead them to the second window, which we call Pentecost, and it depicts the, as it were, tongues of fire coming down upon the 12 and the deep purple remoteness of God and his coming amongst us. And I always have to say, remember that the Pentecost wasn't called that by the early Christian community. For them, it was the early fathers of the church talked about the renewal, the recreation of the world, which is what happens to each of us in baptism. We're filled with the Holy Spirit. We are recreated in that Spirit, and that's our opportunity to make a better person of ourselves and a better world for the people to live in. So that's Henry
Okay.
Haig. See, the name has come back now. I've always had a problem all my life. I've never ever been able to remember names. I can remember doors and I can remember what color they're painted if they haven't been repainted, but names escape me. So Henry Haig is the artist, and he just a couple of weeks, or no, the couple of days before he died, I quite by chance happened to see him come into the cathedral in a wheelchair with his family. And I realized he'd come to look at his window, and it was for the last time. And I said, what a wonderful window, and how everybody admires them. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. I don't know whether there are any more questions or not. Um, the structure of the cathedral was made in concrete, wasn't it? Had there been structural issues and problems with the building?
There have some. Yes, that is true. In fact, there was a renovation in 2014-15. Um, the model was wind tested back in 1969. Um, there is a very strong wind track that comes up the Severn estuary, up what is known as the Gordano Valley by the Avon Suspension Bridge, comes up over Clifton, and then drops down further to the northeast. And the building was tested to 120 miles an hour. So it was designed at the time to withstand that sort of wind pressure. And actually, I think it was in 1987 or 88, there was such a very strong wind. And it blew up and it lifted some of the lead on the roof. Didn't tear it off, but it lifted it, allowed the water to get underneath them. Then the lead flopped down. But about 5 or 6 houses in a neighbouring road in Clifton had their roofs stripped off. So it was quite a fierce wind. So one of the problems has always been a bit of leakage. And when the renewal was done, I learned from the architects that time that um, lead, when it was used in the 1972-3 build, was of such and such weight and thickness, and now the recommended lead roofing has to be 75% heavier and thicker. So it's quite possible that that was the cause of some of the issues of water entering the cathedral. Um, there have been one or two other areas where, um, for instance, one of the two main doors of the portal of Peter and Paul, they were made of timber, and they were coated by William Mitchell, the artist, with fiberglass designs in grey. And unfortunately, after a few years, the top of one of the doors began to crack, the water could get in, and so those doors had to be replaced with glass doors. So those are the two main things, I think. Um, there's obviously, it's never been decorated inside. The white concrete carries the impression of the timber formwork, which incidentally came from the Carrara Sea. That's a test your geography, up at the very north of Russia in the Arctic Circle. The red Russian pine grows so slowly that the grain is very, very noticeable, and that is a feature of the cathedral. So those are the main things, I think. And that,
Uh,
coupled
sorry.
with the fact we had electric underfloor heating, which incidentally was very effective. You could turn the heating on a Thursday night, and depending on the weather, you could turn it off often on a Sunday morning, and it would heat the building for the rest of the week. And then uh, it turned out that the electricity company had been misreading the meter. And so there was quite a big bill. And with the rising cost of electricity at that time, they decided to cut the electric off and decided to have a gas boiler central heating system blowing hot air into the cathedral. Very noisy, very ineffective. You had to turn it off during the liturgy, otherwise you couldn't hear. And as soon as you open a door, all the hot air goes out. So actually, I don't know what they're going to do. I've always campaigned to say you've got to do something about this because it's not going to be feasible for the future. But I'm not a decision taker now. So those are the main things. So there have been some problems, and there have been therefore additional costs.
Okay, I've got a comment here that says, thank you for a very interesting talk. I've always liked Clifton Cathedral. I feel it's very successful, a modern example of a cathedral. It has completeness. It's a very holy space. I don't normally share my ideas about my own opinions, but I must admit I am not really a fan myself. I have visited the cathedral, but not all that recently. But I have to admit that I'm not a fan. I'm afraid, but that's merely a personal opinion.
Yeah, that's fine.
Um, do you think that that the church sort of reflects the sort of liturgical changes of the 1960s and 70s in its form? Was that really principally why it was designed in that way?
Yes, obviously, that was one of the three prime determinants set by the bishop and by the liturgical committee itself. And I think that was the main thing, of course. But
Mm,
for instance, there are little things like you could have mass facing the people ad populum, or you could have mass ad orientem facing the back wall. So in that sense, it was ready to accommodate both. Uh, there's no great reredos, of course.
no.
Actually, it's one of the disputes. People used to say, why don't you put something on the back wall? And I remember Ron Weeks saying, the emptiness of the wall is meant to show you the infinity and the presence of God amongst the assembly. And I thought, for an architect, that was quite a profound statement. But that one or two people always wanted to put a cross up there or something, or whatever.
All right.
So it's not surprising, really, that that's part of
Yeah.
the art decision of people.
Yeah. Okay, it's interesting. Do you think young people are attracted to sort of the modern architecture of churches today?
Um, Well, this is a personal opinion. We do have a lot of young people coming to the cathedral. So in that sense, yes. Some of them are very active. And of course, the university is close by. So that does tend to attract the universities, particularly if they're, from abroad.
Mm,
And of course, the community has changed a lot over the years, and a lot of the residences in the parish area are related to the university, academia, the hospitals, and all that, and to the students themselves. So there's a, there's a very wide variety of people, actually.
mm. Okay, interesting. Right. Okay. Well, I think we'll have to wrap up fairly soon. I think that's an interesting talk, Peter, and thank you very, very much for your great depth of knowledge about the building and the Catholic community at Clifton. It's certainly been very interesting, and I've learned quite a few things this evening. So I'm sure that other attendees have also found it interesting as well. So thanks ever so much
Thank
for your
you.
first.
Thank you.
And I was just going to mention before we finish some future talks as well for anybody who is thinking of joining us for future talks. For example, on Saturday, the 5th of July, we've got Professor Jim Franklin, who's Vice President of the Australian Catholic Historical Society, and we're doing a joint talk between the English Catholic History Association and our Australian equivalent. We did one of these last year as well, but this is this year's one, and so this is quite a big event. So we will be joined by people across Australia and possibly elsewhere as well. And the talk will be on Archbishop Daniel Mannix's enforced stay in England in 1920, a subject of which I know absolutely nothing at the moment, at least anyway. So if you're interested in Australian Catholic history as well as English Catholic history, that may be of interest to you. And then following that as well, in August, Monday, the 11th of August, we have Dr. James Kelly, The Other Reformation from an Early Modern Border Town to Global Catholic Reform. So that should be an interesting talk. And we have talks every single month going up to the end of the year, and I think possibly even to the beginning of next year. So do join us again if you possibly can. And this talk has been recorded and will be on the YouTube channel within a day or two, I would suspect. So thank you very much again, Peter, for a fascinating talk, and thank you very much, everybody, for attending this evening.
Yeah. Thank you for listening.